So good evening and welcome. Thank you. I'm so glad we didn't have quite as blustery of an evening as we had this afternoon, and I'm glad you all made it here. You probably noticed that we're under construction at the moment, and but a year from now, we will be opening the new reimagined campus of the Greenwich Historical Society. And we will have twice as many parking spaces, so for those of you that had to park in the marina, hopefully that won't be necessary in the future. You'll be able to enter our new lobby at grade level. There'll be an elevator, which will take you up to the height of where we are right now, and that makes our entire site universally accessible. So we're very excited about the changes that are coming. These expanded facilities and the expanded programming will allow us to teach American history. It will be transformational for us and for our community, and I thank all of you here tonight who are not only members of the Historical Society, but who have also given generously to the Reimagine the Campus campaign. I'm pleased to announce, and it changes every day, so this is an announcement, that we are within $605,000 of reaching our original campaign goal of $13.5 million. So we're really delighted. And in addition, we have added an endowment bucket and a new planned giving program called the Vanderbilt Society to recognize those who name the Historical Society in their estates. If you have not yet and would be interested in finding out more about our campaign, please feel free to speak to our campaign chairman who is here tonight, and I'm looking for him, Peter Malkin. Thank you, Peter. Or our board chairman, Davida Strackbein, or me, Deborah Mecke, the executive director. And there are also brochures on the check-in table for anyone who's interested in taking one. Now, I just have a couple of announcements. Many of them are in your bulletin, but let me just point out two. On Saturday, November 4th at 11 a.m., we will lay the cornerstone and install a time capsule in the new building, followed by hard hat tours inside of it, and a presentation on what is in store for the community up here in the Vanderbilt Center. And we also then on Sunday, November 12th, from 2 to 4 p.m., we will hold the members' preview of our next exhibition, a groundbreaking exhibition entitled An American Odyssey, The Jewish Experience in Greenwich. It's the first exhibition on this topic. It's based on original research, and it's not to be missed. So please try to come out for our preview, and if not, the exhibition will be on display through mid-April. Now, our format tonight is a 40-minute talk by Lewis Lehrman, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A, which Anna Greco, who was up here in the beginning, will conduct. We are videotaping the questions, so she will pass a microphone to you for your question so that we are sure to hear it. Also, signed copies of Churchill, Roosevelt and Company will be available for purchase at the check-in table until 8:15. And for those of you who are fans of the Astros and Dodgers, we promise you will get home in time to watch Game 1 of the World Series, at least most of it. You have a printed biography of Lewis Lehrman in your program, but I want to share a few personal and professional highlights provided by our speaker. Lewis E. Lehrman was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He is one of 4 children, and he attended local schools. He attributes to his mother his inspiration to work and to play hard, which he did at his alma mater, Yale University, and where he was a Carnegie Teaching Fellow in American and European history for 1 year, followed by working as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow in history at Harvard, where he received his master's degree. Yet he is proud of having attended what he considers the best graduate school in America, the U.S. Army at Fort Knox, Kentucky. He returned to New York to build a young company into a public company and to marry his wife, Louise, who is here tonight. Welcome, Louise. Together, they are the proud parents of 5 children, one of whom is a historian. He's a historian of science and technology and intellectual history, and they have 9 grandchildren. His one foray into oh no, I'm out of date. I'm out of date. My goodness, that's great news. His one foray into politics occurred when he ran for governor of New York on the conservative and Republican ticket, and almost won in a heavily Democratic state, and then went on to work for Ronald Reagan for 3 years. He became a partner at Morgan Stanley and then set up his own investment firm, Lewis Lehrman and Company, which is the business he continues in today, I believe. Together with Richard Gilder, he founded the Lincoln Soldiers Institute at Gettysburg College and the Gilder-Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Resistance at Yale University. The Gilder-Lehrman collection of original historic manuscripts is on display at the New York Historical Society, and he established the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. Tonight, we also salute him for his award of a National Humanities Medal at the White House in 2005, and for his being named a Distinguished Director of the Abraham Lincoln Association in 2013. He has lectured and published widely, and he last spoke at the Greenwich Historical Society 10 years ago on his book, Lincoln at Peoria, The Turning Point. Tonight, he will speak on his 2017 publication, Churchill, Roosevelt and Company, Studies in Character and Statecraft. Please welcome our accomplished scholar and historian, Lewis E. Lehrman.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much. You got it right, except for 9. So I have many people to whom to be very thankful here in this hall. A couple of them are here. I remember Gloria Vanderbilt contacting me very early on, telling me about the glories of the Greenwich Historical Society, and for 2 hours touring this entire property, every nook and cranny. I'm also very grateful to Russ and Debbie Reynolds, old Greenwich hands, because they got me a little bit involved when I think Russ Peter was the president. Yeah. And of course, I've just referred that question to Peter Malkin, who is the man responsible for this really extraordinary campaign to transform the Greenwich Historical Society. Now, Peter is a very distinguished businessman and a philanthropist. He gave me the opportunity to invest in this project. As you know, Peter is an outstanding businessman, but he's also a very good salesman, and that's the way he would put it. So we have gathered in this hall at this hour to contemplate the most colossal war of human history and to focus upon the Anglo-American alliance in World War II. Now, at the onset of war, Anglophobia was a commonplace among civilian and military leaders in Washington. More than a century of Anglo-American competition had led to mutual distrust. Not to mention the revolutionary separation from the mother country, followed by the humiliating War of 1812. Bad blood had also been a consequence of World War I, not least because of Britain's failure to repay its war debts. In England, condescension toward its former colonials still prevailed among the British elites. Still does. Some American politicians believed that sophisticated British leaders such as Winston Churchill and John Maynard Keynes were a clever bunch who would fleece America to keep the British Empire intact. But Winston Churchill never had any doubts about the full support of the United States and that it was absolutely necessary to defeat Hitler's bid for mastery of the European continent. Despite the Prime Minister's intense courtship of FDR during the desperate days of 1940 and 1941, President Roosevelt would not consent to marriage in the war against Nazi Germany. FDR would waver until Pearl Harbor, whereupon a shotgun wedding would be declared between the United Kingdom and the United States, nearly 18 months after the fall of France. Indeed, by the time of Pearl Harbor, on December 7th, 1941, German troops had arrived at the gates of Moscow. And Japanese armed forces were on the move throughout the Western Pacific. Now, what do we know of the provenance of these two self-confident titans of the historic Anglo-American alliance? As a boy, FDR followed the path of the rich and the well-born, having been privately tutored on his father's estate in the Hudson Valley. At 14, he was sent off to Groton School. Churchill, at 7 years of age, was sent off to a very harsh boarding school in England. Then, after his years at Harrow, he would struggle to pass the examination to enter the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. In the family tradition, Roosevelt would go to Harvard, which is somewhere north of New Haven. There he had some success, but he was mortified to be rejected by the Porcellian Club to which his father had belonged. Young Winston, upon graduation from Sandhurst, would see the world both as a junior Army officer in the cavalry and as a well-paid war correspondent. In fact, an extraordinary income, a most irregular role for a British Army officer. I think it can be said that Churchill was all of his life an irregular. Churchill, as a warrior and author, had become world famous by the time Roosevelt had entered Harvard. As a cavalry officer, he would brave war in Cuba, India, South Africa, and the Sudan, there attacking the dervishes in the last great British cavalry charge at Omdurman. During the Boer War, he engineered a sensational prison escape, attaining thereby the national renown he craved as a vehicle by which to enter Parliament. Now, of course, the future Prime Minister thought himself unique, confiding as he did to a lady friend, I quote him, "We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." Also characteristic of Churchill. FDR would marry his not-so-glamorous cousin, Eleanor, in 1905, a wedding presided over by her uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, then President of the United States. This marriage would last, but it was rocked by FDR's affair with Lucy Mercer, his wife's secretary. Churchill would propose to Clementine Hozier in the summer of 1908 at Blenheim, the Marlborough Palace where he was born, grandson of the Duke. This marriage was troubled by the incessant pressures of public life and Churchill's always stretched finances. Churchill would in fact say, "When your expenses exceed your income, it is not time to cut your expenses, it is time to increase your income." And he did. He wrote a total of 20 million words, books, articles, newspaper columns, and earned a quite fabulous income. During World War I, Churchill served in the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. After his humiliation and the great defeat at Gallipoli, he would volunteer for service as a colonel of a brigade in the Belgian trenches, after which he was appointed Minister of Munitions in the Lloyd George cabinet. Roosevelt himself never served in the armed forces, but he would emulate the example of his famous cousin, Teddy, as a hardworking Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the cabinet of Woodrow Wilson. Though Britain had declared war on Germany in September 1939, it was not until May 1940 that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister at the very moment Britain faced the gravest national crisis of her long national history, namely a mortal threat to survival of the nation itself. Moreover, at the end of 1940, Britain was insolvent, a de facto bankrupt. Isolated by the fall of France, Britain now fought the massive German armed forces alone. In the event, Churchill had resolved that he must have an Anglo-American alliance. While shaving, he would say to his son Randolph, I quote him, "I will drag the Americans in." But in fact, it would be Japan and Germany on December 7th and December 11th, 1941, who would drag America into World War II. Now, it is not so well known that at all levels of the Anglo-American alliance, distrust never fully dissipated during the war. The President and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, made known their opposition to Churchill's commitment to maintain the British Empire and its imperial trading preferences. But the Prime Minister would defiantly respond, and I quote him, "I have not become the King's First Minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. But fortunately, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, General Sir Alan Brooke, and General Eisenhower would supervise many senior officers who made the alliance an effective war-making team. Among major civilian officials of the alliance aimed at teamwork were Harry Hopkins, Averell Harriman, Lord Beaverbrook, and of course, Anthony Eden, each the subject of a chapter in my book. Indeed, the gifted Hopkins would become FDR's de facto national security counselor, an unlikely achievement for a former social worker from a small town in Iowa. Hopkins would also gain the trust of the prime minister and that of the standoffish Clementine, even winning the respect of the forbidding Joseph Stalin. After his second FDR-sponsored trip to London in July 1941, Harry Hopkins would take a Navy seaplane in a harrowing flight across the Arctic Ocean, where he met with Joseph Stalin in Moscow for 3 days. He reported that Stalin welcomed him with a few blunt Russian words. I quote Hopkins, "It was like talking to a perfectly coordinated machine. Joseph Stalin knew what he wanted, knew what Russia wanted, and he assumed that you knew too." Now, Stalin persuaded Hopkins that Russia would survive the murderous German assault, led by 3 million German soldiers, an argument which would lead FDR to give massive Lend-Lease aid to Russia with very few strings attached, without which the Soviet Union might have collapsed under the German invasion. Most historians do emphasize that Churchill, Roosevelt and Company won the war in the West and in the Pacific. But less acknowledged is the fact that it was the Soviet army that destroyed the bulk of the German armed forces in the East. In fact, 80%, 4 out of every 5 German soldiers killed in battle died fighting the Russians. One can understand why the Russians are sometimes angry, much more than disappointed, when too much credit is given to the Western Allies in World War II. Of course, victory for the Grand Alliance would come, but FDR would be dead, Churchill out of office, and Joseph Stalin in dictatorial control of most of Eastern Europe. Now, let us for a moment plumb the character of the commanders-in-chief of the Anglo-American alliance. Churchill and FDR were patricians of great ambition, inspired not least by their elite families and famous forebears. Roosevelt would prove the much better grassroots politician, having the political talent to build a loyal Democrat organization in the Republican Hudson Valley, I should say the once Republican Hudson Valley. Franklin Roosevelt, a progressive Democrat, would enter New York politics when the progressive Republican, Theodore Roosevelt, was the most famous American in the world. Politics, however, was always different for Churchill. His heart would always beat to the rhythm of debate in Parliament, not to the noise of grassroots political campaigns. From early days, he was always also a defender of the imperial realm, his political conscience having been formed in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, the apogee of the prestige of the British Empire. FDR, though born a son of special privilege, was humbled and strengthened by his heroic struggle to overcome polio and paralysis. Thereafter, FDR would become the people's politician, much more attuned than Churchill to public opinion. In fact, Roosevelt was the first poll-driven president. But even in early 1941, after the first of 2 wartime presidential victories, FDR did not preside over a decisive congressional majority. Some of the reasons he had such terrible problems in getting his war program through Congress. FDR did not preside over a congressional majority at any point during his 4 terms. Churchill, on the other hand, governed a large majority coalition throughout the war. The Prime Minister would face no parliamentary general election until July 1945, at the end of the war in Europe, whereupon he was summarily dismissed from office by the British voters. In personal relations, Winston Churchill was generally more straightforward than Franklin Roosevelt. FDR, in fact, was practiced at deception, as he himself readily acknowledged. One of his favorite expressions was, "I never let my left hand know what my right hand is doing." His good friend, Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, would say to Roosevelt directly, and I quote Ickes, "You won't even talk frankly with people who are loyal to you, the loyalty of whom you are fully convinced." Roosevelt's devoted speechwriter, Robert Sherwood, wrote, and I quote him, "If either the president or the prime minister could be called a student of Machiavelli, it was Franklin Roosevelt." More tightly wound, more intense than Roosevelt, Churchill would not rest from the detailed prosecution of the war. Day in and day out, the prime minister was all in for the war he was fighting almost all the time. Now, General Hastings Ismay, Churchill's patient military aide, also his liaison to the British chiefs of staff, would make fun of the prime minister's wartime obsession with military strategy and tactics. I quote Ismay, "Churchill is the great military genius of history. He can use one army division on 3 fronts at the same time." Now, unlike Churchill, who respected the British traditions of cabinet government, FDR paid little attention to his cabinet. His attitude toward the State Department bordered on contempt. For example, Secretary of State Cordell Hull was not in Washington when the president would soon depart for his summit conference with the prime minister off the coast of Newfoundland at Placentia Bay in 1941. So Roosevelt invited Sumner Welles, the number 2 man at state whom FDR preferred. Like the president, Welles was a Groton man and a Harvard man. FDR was far more comfortable with Welles than with Hull, a former Tennessee senator. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt would observe, and I quote her, "Franklin is not at ease with people not of his own class." Now, at this Placentia Bay summit near Newfoundland, Roosevelt and Churchill would send a small delegation to Moscow to decide what military resources should be shipped to a beleaguered Russia. To go to Russia, FDR would choose the man who had been managing Lend-Lease in Britain, Averell Harriman, a Groton man too, and the beneficiary, like Roosevelt, of a family fortune. Now, Harriman, if I may digress for a moment, was the not-so-rare American in London who embraced the charms of Pamela Digby Churchill, the Prime Minister's very own daughter-in-law. Edward R. Murrow was another of her suitors. Going with Harriman to Russia was Lord Beaverbrook, a Canadian-born press lord who had served with Churchill in a World War I cabinet. The stubborn Beaverbrook could and did stand up to the Prime Minister. For example, as Minister of Aircraft Production, he proved indispensable to the Royal Air Force victory over the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain during the summer and fall of 1940. A crucial victory because it came promptly after the demoralizing fall of France and the Dunkirk rescue of 1940. But Beaverbrook would later complain, and I quote him, that eating, drinking, and arguing with the Prime Minister nearly killed me, almost made me a drunkard. Now, it is true, not every man could, like Churchill, drink an estimated 20,000 bottles of champagne in one lifetime. I can hardly handle one in a month. FDR was famous for his outward charm, but the president's inward life was utterly opaque, even to those who knew him best. Anna Roosevelt, FDR's devoted daughter, would say no one truly knew FDR, even members of his own family. In fact, FDR confided in no one, almost never wrote anything down, even prohibited the taking of minutes at the meetings of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. Less amiable than FDR, Churchill could be brutally frank. He was also relentless, but his generals and his admirals found his constant cross-examination exasperating. FDR, on the other hand, was a big-picture man, even a bit distant, but the president did make the big decisions. As events would prove, FDR chose his military leaders wisely, men such as General Marshall, General Eisenhower, General Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Force, General Vandergrift of the Marines. So too, his senior admirals, King and Nimitz, Stark and Spruance, Halsey too. In my book, I focus not only on other major civilian and military leaders, but also on dozens of key figures not so well known, including the Soviet spy at Treasury, Harry Dexter White, Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthal's chief deputy. It was Harry Dexter White who was in charge of the momentous Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which established the post-war international monetary and financial system. Now, it is not well known that alone among the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, it was the prime minister who would make the exhausting global travel at great personal risk in order to keep the alliance together. The tireless Churchill would meet Roosevelt 11 times during the war, always in North America, except at Casablanca, Cairo, Tehran, and Yalta. Of the prime minister's courageous travel into the war zones, General Douglas MacArthur would say, and I quote him, "Foreign and hostile lands may be the duty of young pilots, but for a statesman burdened by the world's cares, it is an act of inspiring gallantry and valor." Of the Victoria Cross, the British Medal of Honor, MacArthur wrote, I quote him, "No one of those who wears it deserves to wear it more than Churchill himself." But he never received it. In support of the prime minister, the cautious FDR, the consummate master of public opinion, would slowly raise the temperature of American belligerence in 1940 and in 1941. Indeed, U.S. military authorities began planning for war even in late 1940, 1 year before Pearl Harbor. It was then that Admiral Stark produced the famous Dog Memo on global war strategy, which advocated, remember, this is before the war began, which advocated a Germany-first strategy in the event of war in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, a strategy reconfirmed by Churchill and Roosevelt at the White House shortly after Pearl Harbor. However, it must be said that all three members of the Grand Alliance, Britain, Russia, and the United States, had been unready for a major war that they surely expected. For example, the British and the French, already at war since September 1939, had been overwhelmed in 6 weeks by the German blitzkrieg of May 1940. Joseph Stalin, despite many authentic warnings from all directions, had been caught totally unprepared for the massive German invasion of June 1941, not least because Russia had been Germany's ally from August 1939 until June 1941, the result of a cynical, fascist, communist partnership forged by the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939. Even the U.S. government was not prepared for war with Japan, a war that the evidence shows FDR surely expected. It was in the final 2 years of war that the Churchill-Roosevelt friendship, close friendship, would finally deteriorate. There were sincere policy differences between the two statesmen, confirming the rule of statecraft that nations have no permanent friends, only vital interests. Indeed, the clash of national interests and strong personalities could divide the Anglo-American leaders long before victory was assured. For example, despite the stubborn objections of General Marshall, the Prime Minister and the President would decide to invade North Africa in 1942, thus delaying for 2 years the Anglo-American assault on Northern Europe. This North African invasion of November 1942 was carried out by the amphibious Operation Torch, of which Eisenhower was the supreme Anglo-American commander. This assignment was the general's launching pad to become the supreme Allied commander of Overlord on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious invasion of military history. Now, as at the end of most wars, Anglo-American disputes of 1945 became preoccupied with differing strategies by which to end the war, not to mention the policies with which to govern the post-war world. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Truman were only too aware that Stalin's 6 million triumphant men-at-arms in military occupation of almost all of Eastern Europe hovered over the Yalta and Potsdam summits, giving Stalin the leverage he used so very well. Along the road to war and ultimate Allied victory, there were many misjudgments. Some of them seem ironic, even amusing after the passage of 75 years. For example, in the 1930s, as an early advocate, an aggressive advocate of British Air Force expansion, Churchill would declare, and I quote him, "An airplane cannot sink a battleship because the armor is too thick." And in early 1938, Churchill would say, and I quote him again, "The air menace against properly armed and protected ships of war will not be of a decisive character." Tell that to the victorious Japanese Navy of 1942. Devastating Japanese aircraft carrier attacks on the British Navy and on the British Empire in the Pacific would shock Churchill to the quick. Even more egregious, in the spring of 1941, Stalin would dismiss countless reliable domestic and foreign sources warning him that a massive German invasion of Russia was imminent. He refused to believe it. Stalin's foolhardy myopia would cause disaster and death to strike millions of the Russian people gratuitously. And listen to this one. U.S. Admiral William Leahy, the indispensable chief of staff to FDR, as well as the very first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would say, I quote him, "The atomic bomb will never go off." And I speak as an expert on explosives. History has a way of producing ironies which make one smile at many of the conceits of the present day. In the end, the character and war leadership of the Supreme Allied Commander of the D-Day invasion, General Eisenhower, must not be underestimated. He it was who proved that an American general could manage not only American officers, but also proud British senior commanders. His grin, his diplomacy, his modesty, his low-key ability to inspire, his sheer likability overcame what might otherwise have been insurmountable challenges to Anglo-American unity of command. Thus, it is fitting that we now listen to General Eisenhower's major tribute to the Anglo-American victory given at the Guildhall in London on June 12, 1945. I quote the general. "No one could alone have brought about this result. Had I possessed the military skill of a Marlborough, the wisdom of Solomon, the understanding of Lincoln, I still would have been helpless without the loyalty, the vision, the generosity of thousands upon thousands of British and Americans. Some of them were my companions in the high command. Many were enlisted men and junior officers carrying the fierce brunt of the battle in the field. And many others were back in the United States and here in Great Britain, in London. Moreover, back of us were always our great national war leaders and their civil and military staffs that supported and encouraged us through every trial, every test. The whole was one great team." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Do you have time for a few questions?
I do.
All right. So I have a microphone. You may have noticed that we are taping this lecture, so it will be available on our YouTube channel in about a month. If you ask a question, I ask that you use the microphone. It does not mean that you will be on camera, but your question will be. So we greatly appreciate it. Does anyone have a question? Oh, right here.
How did Churchill convince Roosevelt to do the torch, Operation Torch, and then go on the underside of Europe and delayed 2 years? I had the impression that Churchill rolled him over somehow. Is that wrong, or how would you characterize that?
Well, that's a good metaphor for Churchill's persuasiveness. So remember, America did not enter the war. Did all hear the question? Good. America did not enter the war until December of 1941. At the end of December, Churchill went to Washington, where he conferred with not only his own chiefs of staff, but with the American chiefs of staff. There, they discussed what the strategy should be. It was then that Churchill raised the idea, since they couldn't attack Germany head-on at that time. They didn't have the equipment. There were no launching vehicles. There were no American soldiers in Great Britain, so that it was Churchill who proposed that they head to North Africa, that they had to attack the German forces somewhere, and that was the most convenient place to do it. In addition, the Mediterranean was a strategic base of operations, especially for the British Empire. And Mr. Roosevelt was persuaded that this was a good idea. And then General Marshall immediately proposed that they attack across the Channel in the autumn of 1942. Roosevelt sent Marshall to England to discuss this, and Sir Alan Brooke, the British chief of staff, would not hear of it, and he and Churchill vetoed it for the very simple reasons they had no launching ships to convey the troops across the English Channel. There were no American soldiers in England at the time. The British soldiers were entirely preoccupied in other theaters, whether it was in the Pacific or in North Africa itself. And as a result, the Marshall Plan was vetoed by Churchill and Roosevelt. General Marshall resisted with great vigor, but Churchill and Roosevelt, of course, prevailed. So that's how we got to North Africa. From North Africa, we went to Sicily, and from Sicily to Italy, and ultimately, in 1944, we finally got across the Channel. But it took 2 years to convey hundreds of thousands of American boys to England and train them. Somebody has recently written a book called Hope Island, and England was Hope Island. And there, our American soldiers were prepared for battle, and along with the British, we landed approximately 400,000 men across the Channel after D-Day within 60 days.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture, and I'm getting the impression that you know something about politics. So,
Ancient politics.
So President Obama was considered extremely divisive, and then President Trump is considered extremely divisive, unprecedentedly divisive. How do our divisive politics look from the perspective of history?
It is a good question. Our divisive politics of today are consistent and of a piece with the divisive politics of the 1930s and 1940s. Lord Halifax, who was the ambassador in Washington, the former foreign minister of England under Prime Minister Chamberlain, said that the great success of FDR was dividing the American people into one group which supported him and another group which opposed him very bitterly and very angrily. I think those of us who have studied any part of the New Deal know how bitter the contest was between these two separate factions. And it was not entirely Republicans versus Democrats. It was conservative Democrats from the South, Republicans in the North, and Democrats countrywide who were split sometimes along family lines, county lines, city lines, school lines, but in any event, it was a very divisive period in our history. Generally speaking, American politics has not been a game of beanbag.
You briefly mentioned Harry Truman, and we've all read about how he was kept in the dark about everything. Do you have an opinion as to how he rose through that and handled things?
Harry Truman's great question, and I think you know the answer, Peter. Harry Truman was one of those great surprises of history. Roosevelt did keep him in the dark, but this was characteristic Roosevelt. Robert Sherwood characterized him as the Machiavelli of the administration for the reason that he was very practiced, as I said, at deception. So Truman was his vice president for political purposes, but he saw no need to include him in any of the major discussions. For example, Peter is implying what I think is that Truman became president, he didn't know anything about the atomic bomb. And of course, he was the man to deliver it to Japan twice. Roosevelt had a very curious habit, which I discuss in considerable length in my book, of not disclosing important facts to members of his own administration. So Truman was only one of a large number of disappointed men and women who worked for FDR. For example, it is all the more incomprehensible, Peter, that Truman was not informed because FDR knew in March of 1944 that he had congestive heart failure and that he would die probably within a year. Despite that, he ran for the fourth term in the autumn of 1944, and of course, he died in the spring of 1945. So there was something about FDR. It may not be unjust to say that he really felt he belonged in the White House, and he had done an excellent job. But after, was it three terms, he thought it was not, as Mr. Lincoln said, a good idea to swap horses in the middle of the stream.
I believe that all of Franklin's sons served in the war. Do you have any observations about what effect that had on his leadership?
Well, you're right about that. They did serve, and he was very proud that they served. The family history is complicated. And not only did they all serve in the war, but among the 4 Roosevelt children, there were 18 marriages. So there were complications and frustrations in their child rearing that, forgive the euphemism, but there were complications in their growing up that I am not a psychiatrist, and I have not plumbed the issue, but many people have.
We have time for one more.
Hi, Lou. John Pendergast. How are you?
Hello, John.
Good, thanks. I just wondered, to follow up on the Truman question. I've heard that when Burns, James Francis Burns, who was Truman's Secretary of State, his first one, Roosevelt invited him to Yalta, which is a very important meeting of the European heads of state. But he was really left out in Roosevelt's style of keeping things secret. The question is, if he hadn't been left out, could the beginnings of the Cold War have progressed very differently?
It's time for another book, John. I think the answer is no. Burns himself wrote that all the briefing books of the State Department that were prepared for Roosevelt and himself and the entire delegation to Yalta were never opened the entire period in their trip to Yalta. This was the way Roosevelt did business. He had a tremendous amount of self-confidence in his own opinions, his own judgment, and he was prepared to make decisions and judgments very often without the advice of experts who were along for the ride. So Jimmy Burns had a very high opinion of himself, but I think had he been included, the same thing would have occurred. I have a couple of things I want to entertain you with. Churchill, one of the reasons one falls in love with Churchill is that he was ironic, clever, witty, and humorous. The way he would disarm everybody in Parliament was with his humor, because when an argument was made against a policy position, he would think of something very witty and very clever to say, and of course, the Parliament would laugh the opponent down. So here are a couple of examples of recorded, authentic instances of Churchill's witticism. So Churchill, as Prime Minister, is in his parliamentary office. And there is a Mormon elder who has come to visit him. And he knocks on Churchill's office door. The valet asks the Mormon, when he comes through the door, "Would you like a whiskey and soda?" And the astringent Mormon answers, "Strong drink rageth and stingeth like a serpent." In the back of the room, one hears Churchill, "Where do you get a drink like that? I've been looking for one like that everywhere." So he was a great friend of George Bernard Shaw, the great playwright. Shaw to Churchill, I quote him, "Am reserving 2 tickets for you for my premiere. Come and bring a friend, if you have one." Churchill responds, "Impossible to be present for the first performance. Will attend the second, if there is one." Just one more. Roosevelt and Churchill are together for the first time in the White House in December 1941. Their bedrooms are down the hall from one another. FDR in his wheelchair wheels down the hall. He bursts into Churchill's bedroom after Churchill has taken his very famous daily hot bath. Churchill is buck naked by the window. FDR is slack-jawed, looking directly at him. And Churchill says to the president, "You see, Mr. President, the Prime Minister of the British Empire has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Thank you very much. Thank you.